There is a kind of invisibility that has nothing to do with being unseen. The security cameras caught Marlo Hayes every morning at 4:07 when she badged in through the service entrance of the Harvard Science Center. The motion sensors tracked her cart down the third-floor corridor. The building's systems logged every door she opened, every trash compactor she activated, every fluorescent panel that flickered on as she passed beneath it. The infrastructure of one of the most surveilled institutions in the country registered her presence with perfect fidelity, and not one human being in that building had asked her name in a decade. She was 30 years old. She had worked here since she was 20. The supply closet on the third floor was 8 feet wide and 11 feet deep, and Marlo had organized it with the precision of someone who understood that small spaces either consume you or clarify you. Cleaning chemicals on the left organized by corrosiveness. Replacement parts for the cart on the middle shelf. On the bottom shelf, tucked behind a box of industrial trash liners, a battered calculus textbook held together with 2 strips of silver duct tape, a thermos of black coffee she'd brewed at 3:40 in her apartment 4 blocks away, and a manila folder marked in soft pencil Inventory Q3. The folder was not an inventory of anything. Inside it were 94 pages of mathematics in her own handwriting, small, tight, perfectly aligned, the penmanship of someone who had learned to conserve space, because space was the one resource that was never abundant. 6 complete proofs across the field of complex analysis. 3 of them resolved problems that had remained open in the literature for over a decade. None of them had ever been shown to another human being. She pulled her hair back into the same plain bun she'd worn every shift since she was 20, the motion automatic now requiring nothing from her. The mirror above the utility sink was small and slightly warped along the left edge. She didn't look at it longer than necessary. She hadn't looked at mirrors longer than necessary in 10 years, not because she was afraid of what she'd see, but because she'd trained herself out of the habit of expecting anything from her own reflection. Expectation was a luxury she had categorized alongside a lot of other things she'd set down and not pick back up. Her phone read 4:14. She pulled it out of her jacket pocket and called Isaiah. The line rang twice. He picked up on the third ring with the particular quality of alertness that belongs only to people pretending to be more awake than they are. Her brother was 22 years old, a senior at Northeastern, on a merit scholarship she'd spent 3 years strategically engineering by researching every financial aid appeal process available to Massachusetts residents. She knew his GPA, his class schedule, the name of his academic advisor, the balance of the account she'd set up for him when he was 17. She knew all of this, the way she knew the chemical composition of the cleaning agents on her left shelf, not because someone had handed her the information, but because she had decided it was her responsibility to know. "You up?" she asked. "Barely." His voice had the comfortable roughness of someone who would be fully awake in 40 seconds. He always recovered fast. He'd inherited that from their mother. "Eat breakfast, real breakfast, not the granola bar thing." "I have an 8 o'clock. "Eat before the 8 o'clock. I'm checking your bank app later." A pause that contained, she knew, a small smile. "Yes, ma'am." "Love you." She hung up before he could ask her anything about her day. She hadn't told him about the colloquium. She hadn't told him about the equation that had been glowing on the screen in Hall G during the setup walkthrough she'd observed while mopping the corridor outside its rear entrance 2 days ago. She hadn't told him that the slide she'd seen through the glass panel in the door had stopped her cold for 11 seconds, the mop handle loose in her hands, her whole body going still. The way it went still when she encountered mathematics that mattered. She hadn't told Isaiah a single substantive thing about the inside of her own mind in 10 years. She zipped her jacket. She put her phone in her back pocket. She lifted the folder from the bottom shelf, slipped it between the back cover and the rear pages of the calculus textbook, and set the textbook on the lower rack of her cart beneath the supply tray behind the trash liners. She rolled the cart into the corridor and began her rounds. Third floor first. Always third floor first. This was not an accident of scheduling. The mathematics department's faculty offices occupied most of the third floor's north wing, and the faculty offices generated a specific kind of waste that Marlo had been studying without using that word for the entirety of her employment. Discarded preprints, napkins with half-finished derivations that someone had abandoned at a departmental lunch, photographs of whiteboards that had been printed out for some purpose and then discarded when the purpose passed. She did not steal. She emptied bins. What came out of the bins came out of the bins. What she did with it afterward was her own business conducted at her own kitchen table between 1 and 4 in the morning while Isaiah slept. She had never named the practice, never formalized it to herself. It was simply what she did in the hours the world left her alone. The hallway outside Dr. Preston Merritt's office was the third to last stop on her North Wing route. She'd worked out the route herself 12 months into the job, optimizing for both cleaning efficiency and the particular quality of quiet that settled over the third floor between 4:30 and 5:15 before the early arrivals began filtering in. Merritt was never among the early arrivals. He operated on a schedule built for a man who had never once needed to be anywhere he didn't want to be, which was a different relationship with time than Marlowe had ever known. His name was on the door in the small black letters the department used for all faculty. Dr. Preston Merritt, Peabody Chair of Pure Mathematics. No other ornamentation. Men who were sufficiently certain of their own significance, Marlowe had observed, rarely felt the need to decorate. She stopped the cart. She lifted the bin from the slot beside his door, turned it over. The collection bag, tapped it twice the way she always did to dislodge the things that clung to the sides. She had done this 600 times in the decade she'd worked this floor, and she did it with the same quality of unremarkable efficiency every time, because unremarkable efficiency was its own kind of protection. What she thought about while she did it was the colloquium slide she'd seen 2 days ago. The Merritt boundary, his doctoral thesis published in 2017 when he was 26 years old. A tidal wave in the narrow world of pure mathematics, a problem of elegant brutality that had made his reputation the way a single extraordinary performance can make an athlete's career. An integral identity of sufficient complexity that even its construction was considered an achievement. He had spent the 9 years since its publication demonstrating through successive papers, textbook chapters, and conference talks that no closed-form solution could exist. He had built the architecture of his entire scholarly life on a single proposition: this problem cannot be solved. What she had seen on the slide 2 days ago had confirmed something she had suspected for 6 months. He was wrong. She had known he was wrong since the night she'd brought home the napkin she found in his waste bin the previous spring. The napkin had been folded once, and then crumpled, the action of a man who had committed to a gesture of discarding something, and then hesitated before following through. On it, in Merritt's handwriting, she had learned his handwriting, the way you learn the handwriting of anyone whose waste paper you've handled for years, were 4 lines of derivation. The third line was circled, crossed out with 2 aggressive horizontal strokes, rewritten in the margin with the same error the original line had contained. He had seen something in line 3, something that troubled him enough to cross out and try again. Something that, when he tried again, he had resolved by repeating his original mistake in a slightly different form. He had decided not to see it. She had carried the napkin home in her jacket pocket, unfolded it on her kitchen table at 1:15 in the morning, and spent 4 hours in the specific quality of focused silence that had always been for her the closest thing to peace. By 5:30, before her shift began, she had the proof. It was not complicated once you accepted what line 3 actually contained. A removable discontinuity at the origin, invisible. If you imported a standard continuity assumption the way Merritt had been importing it since 2017, catastrophically load-bearing once you recognized it and refused to look away. The fix was not elegant in itself. What it opened once applied was elegant beyond anything she had seen in the published literature in a decade of reading it alone in a supply closet at the edge of one of the world's great mathematics departments. She had refolded the napkin, slipped it into the back of the calculus textbook, gone to work. She had not told anyone. This was not modesty. It was not fear of rejection exactly, though rejection was a rational prediction for a 30-year-old custodial worker with no institutional affiliation and no publications to her name. It was something more precise than either of those things, the knowledge that the world the proof needed to enter was not a world that had prepared a door for her, and the equally clear knowledge that she had not yet decided whether she cared. She had been not deciding for 6 months. She finished the North Wing by 5:20, the South Wing and the 2 shared faculty common rooms by 6:10, the first floor public spaces by 7:15. She ate the second half of the breakfast she'd packed: a hard-boiled egg, 4 crackers and apples sitting on the service bench in the loading corridor, her cart beside her, the building filling gradually with the sounds of the institution waking up around her. At 8:10, the freight elevator opened on the first floor, and Professor Callum Dressler stepped out. He was 64 years old and had been a member of the Harvard mathematics faculty for 35 years, which meant he had been here longer than Marlowe had been alive. He was not a tall man, but he occupied space with the particular solidity of someone who had long ago made peace with exactly how much of it he was entitled to. His hair had gone fully gray sometime in the last 5 years. She had watched the transition happen the way you watch weather change when you're indoors and have no stake in it. He carried a leather portfolio that was old enough to have developed its own character. The corners softened with use, the strap replaced at some point with one that didn't quite match. He was the chair of the department. He knew the name of every faculty member, every postdoctoral researcher, every graduate student. He had written recommendation letters for 63 students over his career. She knew this because she had once accidentally emptied a bin containing a draft of a letter that began with that number as a piece of context setting. He did not know her name. She watched him cross the lobby without looking in her direction, the way he had crossed every room she had ever occupied at the same time as him. She did not take this personally. She had stopped taking it personally around year 3 when she understood that his unseeing was not malice, but something almost worse. The deep habit of a man who had organized the world into categories of relevance and relevance had specific credentials. What she did not know, what she had no way of knowing, was that Dressler had seen the folder. 2 years ago, on a Tuesday morning in October, she had been pushing her cart past the North Wing elevator when the folder slipped from between the textbook and the edge of the lower rack and fell splaying open on the corridor floor, 3 pages fanning out in an arc across the tile. She had crouched to gather them. He had come around the corner from the elevator exactly at that moment and nearly walked into her cart. He had crouched beside her in instinctive courtesy, the gesture of a person with good reflexes, and picked up 2 of the 3 fan pages. He had looked at them the way you look at something that doesn't match your expectation before your categorization system catches up. 4 seconds. 5. The handwriting dense and small, the mathematics unmistakable to anyone who had spent 35 years immersed in it, a chain of notation running across the page in a hand that was meticulous, in the way that people are meticulous when they have no colleagues to impress, only themselves to satisfy. He handed 1 page back to her. The second page, half a sheet dense with notation, one of the more elegant intermediate steps in what would later become the proof she carried in her folder he kept. Not from any conscious decision. His fingers simply did not release it when they should have, and then the moment for releasing it had passed, and he stood up with it still in his hand, and Marlowe was already gathering the 3rd page from the floor, and he folded it once without looking at it and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. Then he had walked to his office. He had not turned around. He had not asked. He had gone to a faculty meeting at 10 o'clock and a budget review at 2 and a dinner with donors at 7. That evening, sitting at his desk in the quiet of a building that had emptied around him, he had taken the page out of his pocket and looked at it properly for the first time. He had understood what he was holding. He had put it in a plastic sleeve and placed it in the back of his deep desk drawer under a folder of administrative correspondence that he never consulted. He had told himself he was keeping it in case it was needed. He had known, even as he told himself, that the explanation was insufficient. Marlowe had not noticed the missing page. She had gathered the 2 pages he returned, and the one from the floor, slotted them back into the folder, repositioned the folder in the textbook, and pushed the cart to the elevator without breaking her pace. The folder had 94 pages. She could not have identified which one was absent from a glance at the remainder. She did not know on this morning that the man walking across the lobby toward the North Wing had been carrying that page with him for 2 years. That he had thought about it on the train in the late evenings, in the particular 3 a.m. quality of sleeplessness that visits men who have spent long careers making decisions and begun in the approach to the end of something to audit them. He had not spoken about it to anyone. He had not tried to find out who she was. He had made the calculation unconsciously in the way we make the calculations we are most ashamed of, and he had filed it under the vast administrative category of things that were not technically his problem. He was retiring in 8 days. He had one more major departmental event to chair today's colloquium, the one Merritt had been building toward for 6 months, the one with the Boston Globe reporter and the Princeton visitor and the live stream setup that the AV team had finished configuring the previous afternoon. After today, his schedule contained only the gradual bureaucratic unwinding of a 35-year presence at an institution that would, in the way institutions always did, absorb the space he vacated within a single semester. He crossed the lobby. He did not look in her direction. She finished her apple. She put the core in the waste bag on her cart. She checked her phone 8:17. The colloquium started at 9. Hall G occupied the southeast corner of the building's first floor, the largest single room in the Science Center, designed for exactly the kind of event that happened in it today. A formal colloquium with a panel, a projector system capable of filling a 12-foot screen, tiered seating for up to 200, a live stream setup at the back that the department's AV coordinator had been testing since 7:45. The room had good acoustics and bad ventilation, and always smelled by the end of a full morning session of the specific combination of wool coats and nervous intellectual energy that Marlowe associated with every important thing that had ever happened in a room she was not supposed to be part of. She had a legitimate reason to be in Hall G. The rear service aisle ran along the room's north wall, accessible through a door that required her key card, and her morning route included a pass through that aisle to check the waste bins along the back wall. Before a large event, a protocol put in place after a 2019 incident involving an overflowed bin during a visiting lecture. She had done this check before every major colloquium for 4 years. Nobody had ever questioned her presence. She pushed her cart through the service door at 8:44 and stopped. The projector was already live. The first slide was up. The merit boundary occupied the 12-foot screen in white chalk notation on a black background, and the effect of seeing it at that scale, the scale of significance, the scale reserved for things that were supposed to matter, was something she had not prepared for. She had been living with this equation for 6 months in the dimensions of a hand-copied napkin in a kitchen table workspace. Seeing it rendered as a monument was different. It was the difference between reading about a landscape and standing at its edge. She stood still for 11 seconds. Then she saw the slide in full, and what she saw in the slide moved through her body the way cold water moves through a closed system, fast complete, changing the temperature of everything it touched. He had changed line 3 again. Not dramatically. A constraint on the imaginary axis subtle enough that a non-specialist reviewing the slide from the audience might not notice the difference from memory placed precisely where it would close off the specific approach she had been developing for 6 months. It was not the equation from the 2017 paper. It was the 2017 equation with a lock added to the door she had found. She did not know yet when he had added it. She would find out later. For now, she registered it, filed it, and checked the waste bins along the back wall in 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Her movements indistinguishable from every other time she had done this in 4 years. The room was filling. She pushed the cart to the rear service door. She did not leave. She positioned the cart beside the door, the way it was always positioned during colloquium setups. A piece of equipment among equipment, and she stood behind it and watched the room fill around her, as she had watched rooms fill for 10 years with the quality of attention that is available only to people whom the room does not register as watchers. Reeve Calloway from the Boston Globe arrived at 8:51, settled into the third row, opened a reporter's notebook with the practiced efficiency of someone who did this regularly, and had stopped performing the action for an audience. She was 38 years old, her press credential clipped to the outer pocket of a gray blazer that had been washed enough times to look like she didn't think about her appearance while clearly thinking about her appearance. She was here because Merritt had implied in a series of carefully worded emails to the science desk that he was approaching a definitive public statement on the conjecture. The Globe had decided this was worth a feature. Dr. Vivian Okafor arrived at 8:55, coming in through the main door with the understated directness of a woman who had learned long ago that the room always knew when someone important entered it and had decided to make peace with that rather than perform humility about it. She was the visiting Princeton chair here to sit on the panel at Merritt's invitation, and she moved through the room reading it with the specific, quick competence of an academic who had been in hundreds of colloquium rooms and could gauge the temperature of one in under 60 seconds. She settled at the panel table, opened her own notebook, looked at the slide on the screen, and said nothing. Her expression did not change. Callum Dressler took the chair at the end of the front row, the departmental chair's traditional position for these events, close enough to intervene if protocol required, far enough to signal that the intellectual floor belonged to the speaker. He carried the leather portfolio. He set it on his knee. He looked at the slide on the screen. For a half second, no longer something moved across his face. Stellan Briggs arrived last among the principals, sliding into the front row with the careful invisibility of a graduate student who had learned to make himself inconspicuous in any room his advisor occupied. He was 27 years old in the third year of his doctorate under Merritt's supervision, And he had what Marlowe had observed over the years to be one of the more genuinely good minds in the department, attached to one of its more deeply anxious personalities. He was afraid of Merritt in the specific way that people are afraid of brilliant men who make no distinction between intellectual criticism and personal contempt. And the fear had calcified over 3 years into a posture so reflexive, he probably no longer recognized it as fear. He sat down, he opened his notebook. He looked at the slide. Marlowe watched his eyes move across line 3. He blinked, looked again. His pen touched the paper and did not write anything. Merritt took the stage at 9:01 to the sound of 200 people deciding simultaneously to stop talking, the natural hush that precedes a performance by someone whose performance has always previously justified the attention. He was 35 years old and built like a man who had been an athlete in college and had retained the posture, if not the discipline of it, and he moved through the room the way he moved through every room in his life, without checking whether space was available, because space had always been available. He paused at the center of the stage and looked at the room with the particular quality of pleasure that belongs to people who are most fully themselves when being watched. "Good morning." His voice carried without effort, a voice that had spent years in lecture halls and had acquired their acoustic confidence. "Today I want to talk about a problem that has for 9 years defeated every serious attempt at a closed-form solution. My problem, the Merritt boundary." He clicked the slide. The notation filled the screen, and the effect of it in the lit room with the audience's attention pressing against it like a physical force was considerable. He let the moment settle the way a showman lets silence do his work for him. "This integral," he said, pacing now, hands behind his back, "is what we charitably call intractable. I have spent 9 years, 2 textbooks, and an amount of intellectual effort. I have stopped trying to quantify, demonstrating exactly why. Today I'm going to walk you through the definitive version of that demonstration." He paused. His hand went to his jacket pocket. "But first, because I'm feeling generous this morning, and because today is being live streamed, and because I believe very strongly that mathematics should have a sense of theater." He withdrew a stopwatch. The room shifted. "If anyone in this hall can produce a valid closed-form solution to this integral within 2 minutes starting from the moment I start this clock, I will resign my chair." He paused for the murmur to settle. "I will hand them my office keys. And because I am above everything else, a man who honors his commitments." Another pause, calibrated, practiced. "I will marry them on the spot." The room laughed. He smiled into it like a man warming himself. "I don't mean the Putnam finalists in the front row. Sit down. I mean anyone. The undergraduate auditing in the back, the visiting scholar who flew in last night." His eyes moved as if idly toward the rear of the room. "Even the maintenance staff." He looked at Marlowe. The look was the particular kind of performance that requires an audience. Not a private cruelty, but a public one, the kind that needs witnesses to have its full effect. He smiled at the crowd, then back at her, a gesture that completed a circuit he had built between her visible presence and her supposed intellectual absence, using both as props. "Yes!" His voice was warmly amused, the tone of a man being generously absurd. "Even her. 2 minutes, marriage proposal included." He clicked the stopwatch theatrically. "Don't all rush at once." The laughter was uneven, full in some sections of the room, absent in others. In the front row, Stellan Briggs muttered something short and quiet into his notebook that was not, judging by his expression, laughter. Reeve Calloway in row 3 set her pen down on top of her notebook, not the gesture of someone pausing to think, but the gesture of someone deciding something. Vivian Okafor did not move at all. Callum Dressler at the end of the front row looked from Merritt to Marlowe and back, and the something that crossed his face this time was less ambiguous than what had crossed it when he looked at the slide. The leather portfolio on his knees shifted slightly. The marker had skipped off the edge of the stage and landed at Marlowe's feet when Merritt's hand gesture carried too far, not precisely thrown at her, but not thrown at her either, the deniability built into the motion from the beginning. She looked at it. She looked at the slide on the screen. Then she did something that nobody in the room, not Vivian Okafor, not Reeve Calloway, not Stellan Briggs, not Callum Dressler, at the end of the front row had prepared for. She bent down and picked it up. She did not look at Merritt. She straightened, marker in hand, and she looked at the screen, and the look on her face was the look that crosses a face when something previously theoretical becomes concrete, when a calculation that has lived only in private for 6 months is suddenly real in the world at the scale of a 12-foot projection screen in a room with 200 people and a live camera. Her cart was beside the service door. The folder marked Inventory Q3 was in the textbook on the lower rack. In the folder were 94 pages she had written alone at a kitchen table in the hours between midnight and 5 a.m. And on one of those pages, worked out in her own small, meticulous hand, was what she had brought with her every shift for 6 months without deciding why. She looked at the screen for 4 seconds. She looked at the marker in her hand. Then she began to walk. Not fast, not the speed of impulse, but the speed of someone who has been deciding something for a very long time and has finally in this specific moment finished. The walk carried her past her cart, past the rear seats down the side aisle, toward the panel table where Vivian Okafor sat with her notebook open and her pen in her hand and an expression that had not yet committed itself to any particular interpretation of what was happening. Marlo stopped beside her. She kept her voice low just for Okafor, which meant just between the two of them, which was the first time in 10 years she had said anything in this building that was meant for a specific person rather than for the general performance of her invisible function. Professor Okafor. Her voice was steady, the steadiness of something that has moved past the point where nervousness is a useful response. May I have the floor for the 2 minutes he's offering? Vivian Okafor looked at her. The look lasted 3 full seconds. In it was a quality of attention that Marlo had not felt directed at her in this building in a decade. Not the attention of assessment, not the attention of an institutional gaze, deciding what category to put her in, but the attention of one person looking at another person and arriving at a conclusion about who they were before they had finished speaking. Vivian Okafor set down her pen. By all means, Miss Hayes. Her voice was unhurried, carrying to the room without being raised. The floor is yours. The camera swung. In the front row, Callum Dressler's leather portfolio slid from his knee to the floor, and he did not pick it up. His eyes were on Marlo as she turned from the panel table and began to walk toward the stage marker. In hand, the folder with 94 pages still on the lower rack of her cart at the back of the room. All the mathematics she would need already completely in her head. Merritt turned at the sound of approaching footsteps. His laugh was genuine, the laugh of a man who thought the universe had just handed him the best punchline of his career. Oh, this is fantastic. He held the stopwatch out toward her like an offering. By all means, 2 minutes starting. She walked past him. She walked to the chalk tray and selected a fresh marker, ignoring the one he was holding, and turned to face the 12-foot screen. Behind her, Preston Merritt was grinning at the audience the way people grin when they are absolutely certain of the outcome. The stopwatch clicked. The live stream counter on the back wall monitor, visible to everyone in the room except Marlo, read 83 viewers. She looked at line 3. She had been looking at line 3 in one form or another for 6 months. She knew exactly what it contained. She knew exactly what he had missed in it, and she knew exactly what he had added to it on this slide in the hours before this room filled in the space of a small and careful betrayal that he had calculated would be invisible from 200 feet away. She was not 200 feet away. The room had gone quiet in a way it had not been quiet before, not the polite attention quiet of a colloquium audience waiting for a speaker to begin, but something denser, the quiet of people who have recognized without yet being able to say why, that they may be watching something they will want to have been present for. Marlo raised the marker. She did not start at the bottom. She did not start at the top. She pointed the marker at the center of the screen at the third line of Preston Merritt's 9-year foundation, and the motion of her arm made the decision visible to 200 people before she had spoken a single word. The live stream counter ticked from 83 to 147. Outside, the autumn morning moved through the campus with no knowledge of what was happening in Hall G. The way mornings always move, indifferent, available to everyone, changed by nothing. Inside, a woman who had been invisible for 10 years lifted a marker to a 12-foot screen and became for the first time the largest thing in the room. She did not begin writing immediately. The stopwatch was running. The room knew the stopwatch was running. Every person in it could feel the seconds moving through the air, the way you feel a change in pressure before weather arrives. Merritt stood 6 feet behind her with the particular posture of a man who had constructed this situation as a comedy and was discovering at the moment of its performance that the audience had stopped laughing. Marlo stood with the marker at her side, her head tilted 3 degrees to the right, reading the equation from top to bottom, the way a structural engineer reads a building before deciding where to place a load. 15 seconds passed, 20. In the front row, Stellan Briggs had stopped breathing in any meaningful sense. His pen hovered over the open notebook without touching it. Beside the panel table, Vivian Okafor sat with her hands folded, her eyes on the board, her lips moving with the small, involuntary motion of a mathematician who has encountered something worth tracking in real time. Callum Dressler, at the end of the row, had not retrieved his portfolio from the floor. He was watching Marlowe with the particular quality of attention that belongs to men confronting a debt they had spent years telling themselves was theoretical. Then Marlowe raised the marker. She did not write near the integral. She did not start at the bottom of the board, where student presenters always started working upward toward the elevated notation, with the deference of people building towards something they considered above them. She brought the marker to line 3, the precise location, the exact coordinates of what she had known for 6 months, drew a clean circle around it, and turned to face the room. Her voice was not a lecture voice. It was not performing. It was the voice of someone reporting a fact that has been true for a long time, regardless of whether anyone was present to receive it. Professor Merritt, on line 3, you've assumed continuity of the function at the origin. It isn't continuous there. There's a removable discontinuity, but only after you redefine the limit from below. The silence that followed was not polite. It was the silence of 200 people whose bodies had simultaneously recognized that something structural had just been said before their minds had fully resolved what it meant. In the second row, a graduate student turned to look at the student beside him. Neither spoke. Merritt recovered in under 2 seconds. The smile stayed, though it had changed character, gone from a man's amusement at a situation he controlled to a man's amusement at a situation he was managing. That's a notational convention, Miss Hayes, standard in the field. It's a load-bearing assumption. No pause before her response. If line 3 is wrong, every line after it inherits the error. Even if, and I'm saying if that were true, identifying an error is not a solution. His hand lifted toward the stopwatch. The bet was for a closed-form solution. The clock is running. Marlowe did not look at the stopwatch. She wrote a correction beside his line 3, small, precise, no erasure of his work, written in the same space. The way a physician annotates a chart without replacing its history, and the marks she made were not improvised. They were executed. There is a difference that is visible to anyone who has watched enough people write mathematics in real time. The difference between someone solving at a board with all the uncertainty that implies thinking forward into unknown territory versus someone transcribing from an interior document they have already completed. Stellan Briggs in the front row saw the difference. His pen finally touched the paper. He wrote 2 words, stopped, looked at the board, wrote 2 more. A single graduate student in the back of the room said quietly enough that it was clearly not intended for general consumption, but loudly enough that the room heard it anyway. Oh my God. The live stream counter on the back wall monitor, visible to everyone except Marlowe, turned over from 400 to 800 between one breath and the next. Vivian Okafor stood up. She did not make a speech of it. She walked from the panel table to the board, in 8 steps stood beside what Marlowe had written, read it with the particular focused stillness of someone for whom reading mathematics is as natural as reading a sentence, a stillness in which the room held its breath. 5 full seconds. 6. Then she turned. For the record, her voice carried to the room without effort, without performance, with the flat authority of a statement made under oath. Miss Hayes is correct about line 3. I would have flagged this in a referee report. I'm verifying it in real time on camera in front of this room. She looked at Marlowe. The clock continues to run. You have 91 seconds remaining. She walked back to her seat. What happened to the room in the following 4 seconds had a physical quality. The sound of a crowd exhaling together, not from relief, but from the recalibration of understanding. Marlowe was no longer a person who had made an interesting claim. She was a person whose mathematics had been formally endorsed on a live broadcast by the visiting chair from Princeton. The live stream counter moved from 1,400 to 3,200 in the time it took Reeve Calloway to pick up her pen, look at what she'd written in her notebook 30 seconds ago, and underline it twice. Merritt spread his hands toward the audience with the ease of a man changing terrain when the first position becomes untenable. Ladies and gentlemen, a creative observation properly verified. Whether it survives the full weight of peer review is, I'm using your time. Marlowe had not turned from the board. The room absorbed this. Not laughter, something sharper than laughter, the involuntary sound of 200 people recognizing a response they had not anticipated from a direction they had not expected. She lifted the marker. She introduced the polar transformation first, a clean redrawing of the integral using radial coordinates, a move that anyone who had taken graduate complex analysis would recognize, which was exactly what she had said. It was nothing new. What made it different was not the technique, but the placement, the specific choice of where to enter the integral and what she was opening by entering there. Stellan Briggs leaned forward until he was nearly out of his seat. She's going to use the hidden symmetry. His whisper was audible to the four people nearest him, and it traveled the way things travel in rooms that have gotten very quiet. She found the symmetry he never found. In Brooklyn, 4 miles from the Harvard campus, in the geography of the city, but 4 miles in the way that two different worlds are sometimes separated by only the width of a river. Isaiah was at his desk with his laptop open to a differential equations problem set he had been staring at for 40 minutes. His phone lit up 3 times in 45 seconds. 3 different contacts, 3 separate messages, the same link embedded in all of them. The last one was from his roommate who was standing in the doorway of the bedroom pointing at his own phone with the expression of someone who has witnessed something public that involves someone private. Isaiah opened the link. The live stream loaded with the slight delay of a connection catching up to real-time events, and for 2 seconds he saw only the back of a woman's head, her hair in a plain bun, her shoulders square under a uniform that was 2 sizes too large, her right arm raised toward a 12-foot screen. Then the camera angle shifted and he saw her face in profile, and his differential equations problem set went somewhere he would not remember afterward. He slid off the chair. He sat on the floor with his back against the desk and his knees drawn up and the phone held in both hands, not from any strategic decision, but because his legs had simply declined to continue the project of holding him upright. He was looking at his sister. Not the version of his sister he had known for 22 years. Not the woman who woke at 3 a.m. to review his financial aid paperwork, who called at 4 in the morning to remind him to eat breakfast, who had never once in his memory talked about herself as someone who wanted things. He was looking at a stranger who shared her face, a stranger who was doing something extraordinary in public while he had been sitting 4 miles away not knowing. He put his thumb on his grandmother's name in his contacts. Grandma Edna picked up on the second ring in Atlanta, 82 years old with bad knees and the particular quality of alertness that belongs to women who have spent their lives waking early because someone always needed something. He held the phone up to the laptop screen without speaking. She heard the room. She would understand. Back in Hall G, Marlowe was writing the contour deformation. She drew the loop in the complex plane in the upper right corner of the board, the small gamma she had always used in her private notation, a closed curve that deformed the integration path away from the discontinuity in a manner that was as she had told the room available in any graduate textbook. What was not in any graduate textbook was the specific placement she had chosen, the angle of approach that exposed a bilateral symmetry in the Merritt boundary that Merritt himself had never seen. She knew he hadn't seen it because if he had seen it, the napkin in his waistbin would have shown him working toward it rather than away from it. The napkin had shown her everything about what he had found and everything about what he had refused to follow. The symmetry had been waiting in the structure of his own work for 9 years, invisible to the person who built the structure, because he had been too invested in a particular conclusion to look at what the structure itself was trying to say. 2 faculty members in the front row stood up not to leave, but because they could not remain sitting in the presence of what was being written on the board. The live stream counter passed 17,000. Merritt stepped forward. His voice had lost the lecture hall warmth it began with, had compressed into something harder and more urgent. Hold on, that substitution doesn't preserve my boundary condition. It does. Her marker did not slow. If you accept that the boundary I'm preserving isn't the one you defined. She underlined a small notation in the corner of the board, 3 marks almost invisible from the audience seats. Yours assumed continuity at 0. Mine doesn't need to. Stellan Briggs wrote 1 word in his notebook in letters larger than anything else on the page. Merritt walked to this panel table. His voice was quiet now, directed at Vivian Okafor, with the low urgency of a man attempting to locate institutional support before the ground shifts too far beneath him. Professor Okafor, as chair of this panel, I'd like formal verification of any claim made on this board. We're being live streamed. I'm not going to have my work overturned by a performance. He had made a calculation. It was, Marlowe understood later, a rational calculation, given what he knew at the moment, that Vivian Okafor was an establishment figure, a Princeton chair, a person whose reputation was tied to the institutions that had produced and ratified her, a person who would, when the question was framed as a choice between him and a custodial worker with no affiliation aligned with the structure that had made them both. He had not accounted for the specific kind of woman Vivian Okafor was. She stood up. She walked past him without looking at him, a motion so clean and complete in its message that several people in the audience registered it before they registered anything she said. She went to the board. She read what Marlowe had written with full focused attention, her eyes moving line by line with the unhurried thoroughness of a mathematician who is not performing certainty but arriving at it. The room waited through 12 seconds of this. 13. Then she turned, and her voice was not warm, but it was exact. The verification stands. Miss Hayes's notation is valid. The clock continues. She returned to her seat. She did not look at Merritt. The live stream counter passed 25,000. Reeve Calloway in row 3 had stopped taking notes. She was recording on her phone, held steady in her right hand, her left hand gripping the seat edge in the manner of someone who has decided the most important thing they can do right now is not move. Merritt returned to the center of the stage. He was not done. He was a man who had spent 9 years building a specific kind of intellectual authority, the authority that resides not merely in credentials, but in the total architecture of a career oriented around a single problem. And that authority was now doing what it had always done, under pressure escalating. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. The folder was administrative. It had his name on the tab in the font of the department's records office, and it contained information that someone in his position with his access had no legitimate professional reason to have assembled about a member of the custodial staff. He turned to the room with the deliberate poise of a man who has decided that if the floor is going to tilt, he will choose the direction. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice recovered its full carrying power. Before we allow this to become something it isn't, let me put a few facts on the record. He opened the folder. This woman's name is Marlowe Hayes, Massachusetts Institute of Technology Mathematics, 2013 to 2016. Withdrew at the age of 20, no degree, no publications, no institutional affiliation of any kind. A pause that he filled with the specific quality of silence that precedes a verdict. Custodial staff at this university for the past 10 years. He turned to Marlowe, who had not stopped looking at the board. I'm sure your life has taken the turns it had to Miss Hayes, but let's not allow the room to confuse a compelling performance for something it isn't. Look at her, ladies and gentlemen. His voice carried something naked in it now, not the warm cruelty of the joke at the beginning of the hour, but the cold cruelty of a man reaching for a weapon because the other ones haven't worked. Look at her, then look at me. Then tell me with a straight face that this is the woman you'd have me marry. Two people stood up in the middle section and walked out without looking at anyone. A woman in row 5 said something short and audible. Reeve Calloway lowered her phone. Her hand was over her mouth. Vivian Okafor rose from her seat fast, the motion of a person whose body has made a decision before their deliberation is complete, but Marlowe's hand came up. One motion, palm out at waist height. The signal was clear. Vivian sat back down. The room turned to Marlowe and found her looking at Merritt with an expression that contained no surprise. Not because she had predicted this exact sequence, but because she had for 10 years understood the grammar of this specific kind of moment, the moment when a man who has run out of legitimate responses reaches for the oldest vocabulary available to him. She had simply not expected it to happen in front of 25,000 people on a live stream. She turned to the camera. Not to the audience, not to Merritt, not to Vivian Okafor or Reeve Calloway, or Callum Dressler at the end of the front row with his leather portfolio still on the floor where it had fallen. To the camera. To Isaiah in Brooklyn. To Grandma Edna in Atlanta with the phone held up to a laptop screen. To every person who had opened a browser window in the last 8 minutes from a break room, a hospital corridor, a kitchen table in a city she would never visit. Professor Merritt just told you why I left MIT. Her voice was level in the way that things are level when every degree of their steadiness has been earned through deliberate work rather than inherited ease. He didn't tell you the rest. A breath. My mother had stage 4 ovarian cancer. My brother was 12 years old. I was 20. I was the only person who could do both jobs. She paused for one full second. I'd do it again. The room made a sound that was not applause, not a gasp, but a third thing. The sound of 200 people recognizing a statement that could not be argued with because it wasn't an argument. Vivian Okafor stood up from the panel table. She took off her jacket, the dark blazer with the Princeton seal visible on the inside of the lapel, folded it with the unhurried precision of someone making a deliberate gesture, rather than a reflexive one, walked to the empty chair beside the main podium and laid it across the back. Then she walked down the 3 steps from the panel platform and sat in the front row of the audience in an empty seat beside a graduate student who slid over without being asked. The message was architectural. That seat beside the podium, the speaker's chair, the presenter's chair, the chair that announced to every person in the room what category of person was permitted to occupy the center of this space, was empty. The Princeton seal was visible to every camera angle. The statement required no words: that chair belongs to the person standing at the board. Marlo looked at the jacket. She looked at Vivian in the front row. In Brooklyn, Isaiah was on the floor pressing his back against the desk with the quality of stillness that belongs to people watching something they cannot believe and cannot stop watching. His grandmother's voice came from the phone, low, continuous, the same 2 syllables repeated with increasing intensity, the specific prayer of a woman whose faith had survived everything the world had sent her. Callum Dressler at the end of the front row was looking at Marlo with both hands pressed flat against his knees. He was 64 years old. In 8 days, he would walk out of this building for the last time with a career's worth of choices packed into whatever evaluation a man makes of himself in the decade before he stops being professionally legible to the world. He was doing that accounting now in the 30 seconds of charged silence following Vivian's gesture, and the ledger was not balancing the way he had always assumed it would. He thought about a Tuesday morning in October 2 years ago. A corridor, a folder splayed open on the floor, a page he had folded into his jacket pocket rather than returned. The faculty meeting at 10. The live stream counter on the back wall turned over from 30,000 to 38,000. Marlo turned back to the board. The stopwatch was at 42 seconds. She lifted the marker. She found the hidden symmetry. She had known it was there, had known the exact coordinates of it for 6 months, had worked the approach from 11 different directions in her kitchen, eliminating the paths that didn't hold until only one remained, the one that did. She circled it now with a single clean arc of the marker, labeled it, with a notation of her own design, drew a small triangle in the corner of the board, the way a cartographer marks something worth returning to. 2 more people in the audience rose to their feet, pulled upright by what was unfolding on the board, the way an unexpected sound pulls the head toward its source. Stellan Briggs closed his notebook. He looked at the board with both hands at his temples, the posture of someone who has stopped trying to track a proof in writing, because the proof has exceeded the speed at which writing can be useful. Later, he would remember this moment as the moment he understood that the 9 years he had spent in Merritt's orbit absorbing the unspoken curriculum that brilliance in mathematics was a finite resource, unequally distributed, had been an education in a lie. Merritt tried one more time. His voice was different now, stripped of the lecture hall projection, of the amused warmth of the institutional authority he had been invoking since Vivian sat down. What was left was the voice of a person speaking from a position that was no longer a position. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to remind the room that correctness is not rigor. This is a performance, however entertaining, and when it concludes, we will need to— You're using my time. She still had not turned around. Miss Hayes, you've interrupted me twice. You get the same number of minutes I get. You've used yours. The marker moved. I haven't finished. The live stream counter passed 45,000. Reeve Calloway had her phone up again. Her left hand no longer gripping the seat edge, but pressed flat against her sternum in the involuntary gesture of a person trying to stay composed in the presence of something they are not composed about. She was a journalist. She had been in rooms where important things happened. She would later say to the editor who asked her how she'd known to stay for the full session rather than leaving after Merritt's opening remarks that she had not known. She had simply been unable to leave. The stopwatch hit 30 seconds. Marlo invoked the residue. A single term circled its value written beside it in a clean fraction. No irrational components, no messy remainders. A number that had the quality of something that had been waiting in a simple form for the right question to reveal it. The integral on the screen, the 12-foot monument to 9 years of one man's certainty about what could not be done, began to collapse. Not collapse in the sense of failure, but collapse in the mathematical sense. The productive folding of complexity into simplicity, the proof fulfilling its final obligation by becoming smaller than where it started. The stopwatch hit 20 seconds. Marlowe's marker stopped. She lowered her arm. She looked at the board for 3 full seconds, not checking her work. The work was complete, but acknowledging something. The way you acknowledge the end of something that has taken a long time to finish. Then she turned around. The stopwatch read 14 seconds. She looked at Merritt. She looked at the slide. Her voice when it came was not loud. The microphone clipped to her uniform collar placed there by the AV coordinator 90 minutes ago as part of the standard live stream setup. A procedural decision that would turn out to be among the more consequential procedural decisions the Harvard Mathematics Department had ever made, picked up every word with the flat clarity of something recorded for the permanent record. You changed the problem. The room rustled. Confused murmurs moved through the seats. Merritt's face went through a sequence of expressions in under 2 seconds, something he couldn't control, the involuntary transparency of a man whose prepared responses didn't cover this specific contingency. I don't know what you mean, Miss Hayes. The slide is the slide. The slide is not the 2017 paper. She did not raise her voice. The boundary on the imaginary axis is new. It wasn't in the published version. She turned from him to the front row. Stellan. Stellan Briggs looked up from his notebook with the expression of a man who has just heard his name called, in a context he was hoping to observe rather than participate in. Pull up the 2017 paper, the published version, the one in the public record, side by side with what's on the screen. He didn't move for 3 seconds. Then Vivian Okafor from the front row said his name. Just his name. The same quality of quiet she had used with Merritt at the panel table, not a command in form, but absolute in practice. Stellan's hands went to his laptop. The room held while he typed. The hall's secondary projector, the one built into the left wall for dual display presentations, flickered to life. The 2017 paper's integral appeared beside the slide Merritt had been lecturing from. They were not the same equation. The constraint on the imaginary axis, small, precise, placed exactly where it would foreclose. The approach Marlowe had been developing was in the slide. It was not in the 2017 paper. It had not existed in any published form of the Merritt boundary. It had been added in the hours before this colloquium to a presentation that was being live-streamed to what was now on the back wall counter 51,000 viewers. The realization moved through the room in a wave. Not the fast wave of surprise, but the slow wave of comprehension, the kind that travels from the front of a space to the back and takes everyone it passes through a moment to absorb. People physically adjusted their position in their seats, leaning back, some of them, as if the information required more distance to be held clearly. Reeve Calloway's pen was moving. Stellan Briggs was staring at the dual projection with the expression of a man looking at evidence he had not been asked to find but could not now unsee. Vivian Okafor rose from the front row audience seat. She walked back to the panel table. She stood behind it, facing the room with the quality of stillness that precedes a formal statement. When she spoke, there was no warmth in her voice, but there was a precision that carried its own weight. Preston. One word, his first name. The use of it without title in this room on this microphone in front of this number of witnesses was not an intimacy. It was a boundary being drawn. She walked to the board. She picked up the eraser. With a single long horizontal stroke, she removed the unauthorized constraint from the board copy of the equation, not erasing Merritt's full derivation, but excising the addition that had no standing in the published literature. Then she walked to the podium where the stopwatch sat still running at 6 seconds. She stopped it. She held it for a moment, then pressed the reset. The bet stands. Her voice went to the whole room, to the cameras, to the 51,000 people, watching a number climb on a monitor that only the audience could see. Original equation, 2 full minutes from this moment. She set the watch down. She pressed start. The number on the screen read 200. It began to count down. Marlowe was already facing the board. She picked up the marker. She did not look at Merritt. She did not look at Callum Dressler, who had risen from his seat at the end of the front row and was now standing, not speaking, not moving toward the stage, simply standing the way a man stands when he finally understands that the correct response to something is to be upright for it. The live stream counter turned over from 51,000 to 63,000 in the 12 seconds between Vivian resetting the clock and Marlowe drawing the first line. The board was clean. The equation was the real one. The 2017 version, the version that contained line 3 as it had always been, and the hidden symmetry she had found in a supply closet at 2 a.m. in the year she was 29 years old. She had already solved it. She had solved it 6 months ago on a kitchen table in a 4-block radius of this building. What she was about to do was not discovery. It was testimony. She lifted her chin. She began to write. The marker moved without hesitation. Not the speed of someone racing a clock, but the speed of someone for whom the clock had become irrelevant. A formality governing a process that had already reached its conclusion somewhere private, long before this room existed as a stage for it. Marlowe's first line on the clean board was the polar transformation, the same entry point she had used before the reset, the same move Stellan had recognized and named aloud. But with the real equation beneath it, without the constraint Merritt had added to lock the door, the transformation opened differently. The path it revealed was not blocked. The symmetry at the end of it was reachable. The room understood this before the mathematics made it explicit. There is a quality of attention in a space where everyone present, regardless of technical knowledge, recognizes that they are watching something move toward completion. The breath collectively shallowed the bodies collectively. Still the specific hush of 200 people who have stopped managing their reactions because the reactions have outpaced management. Stellan Briggs had both hands pressed against his temples. He was reading the board line by line, staying with it, his notebook abandoned because there was no longer any purpose in recording what could be witnessed. Later he would say that the experience of watching the proof unfold in real time was like watching a building construction video played in reverse, the complexity receding the structure, simplifying the whole thing, moving inevitably toward a foundation that turned out to be smaller and cleaner than anything the superstructure had suggested. The stopwatch on the podium read 1:41. Marlowe introduced the contour deformation, drawing the small gamma in the upper right corner of the board with the same precision she had used earlier, the same placement, the same angle of approach. What the placement did to the real equation without the artificial constraint, without the lock Merritt had added in the hours before the room filled, was immediate. The bilateral symmetry became visible in the structure of the integral, the way something submerged becomes visible when the water is pulled back. Not created by the observation, but revealed by it, having been present all along in the 9 years of published literature that Merritt had built his career upon without ever standing in exactly this position to look. 3 faculty members who had remained seated through every previous development now stood pulled to their feet by the specific gravity of what was being written. The live stream counter on the back wall climbed past 70,000. The Harvard Mathematics Department's YouTube channel was gaining subscribers at a rate that the channel's administrator, who was also the department's communications coordinator, would later describe as not a thing that has a precedent in our category. The comments were moving too fast to read. One comment in all capital letters held on the screen for a full second before the scroll took it. She has been here the whole time. Merritt stood at the side of the stage. He had stopped attempting to speak. The posture that remained after the speaking stopped was the posture of a man who had used every available resource and had arrived at the boundary of what resource could accomplish and what lay past. That boundary was something he had no preparation for. The experience of watching his own work made more complete by a person he had publicly classified as incapable of understanding a single line of it. His arms were at his sides. The stopwatch he had carried into the room like a prop in a performance he was certain he controlled hung from his right hand, forgotten swinging slightly with the movement of his breathing. He was doing the mathematics. That was the detail nobody in the room remarked on, though several people saw it. The small movements of his eyes tracking Marlowe's lines, the almost imperceptible motion of his lips working through the notation. He was following her proof in real time, the way you follow the moves of someone playing a game you invented against you, and he was arriving at the same place she was arriving, line by line, step by step, with the particular quality of dread that belongs to people who understand precisely what they are losing and cannot stop its progress. The stopwatch in Vivian's hand read 1:08. Marlowe circled the hidden symmetry. The small triangle she drew in the corner of the board to flag it was the same triangle she had drawn before the reset. Her notation, her private cartography developed over years of working alone, now visible to 70,000 people on a live stream, and 200 people in a room that had the quality of held breath. In the back, a young black woman who had come to this colloquium because it was on her department's calendar, and she hadn't had a reason not to attend, had moved from the rear wall to the center aisle, drifting toward the front, with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who is afraid that moving too fast will disturb something fragile, that the thing happening at the front of the room might stop if she breaks the air wrong. She reached the second row. A graduate student slid over without being asked. She sat down. Her notebook was open on her knee, but she was not writing in it. She was watching Marlowe with the particular quality of attention that is not admiration. Admiration has distance in it, but something closer to recognition. The recognition of a person seeing for the first time a version of a door they had been told did not exist in any wall they were permitted to approach. In Atlanta, Grandma Edna had walked from her armchair to the small wooden table in her hallway. Her knees were bad. The walk took her longer than it used to. On the table was a framed photograph of her daughter taken the year before she died in the kitchen of the house in Dorchester, one hand raised toward the camera in the gesture of a woman saying both hello and not yet. Grandma Edna turned the frame until it faced the television, so her daughter could see. So wherever her daughter was, she would know. In Brooklyn, Isaiah had his phone on the floor beside him, Grandma Edna's voice coming from the speaker, and he was watching the laptop screen with his hands in his lap thinking about the years. Not any specific year, the accumulation of them, the decade of 4 a.m. calls and bank account checks and grocery deliveries he'd found in the refrigerator without asking, the decade during which his sister had existed in his life as a function of provider and infrastructure. He had never once, not with any real weight of attention, asked what she was when nobody needed her to be anything. He pressed his hands over his face. Grandma Edna's voice kept coming from the floor. The stopwatch read 042. Marlowe invoked the residue, one term circled with a single arc of the marker. Its value written beside it in a fraction that contained no irrational components, no messy remainders. A number of the specific clean simplicity that pure mathematics produces when a proof has found its true path, rather than forcing its way through resistant terrain. The expression on the board, the 12-foot integral that had for 9 years been the monument to a man's certainty about what was permanently beyond reach, had been collapsing since line 4. What remained was not a ruin. It was a foundation cleared of everything that had been built above it, visible in its actual dimensions for the first time. The stopwatch read 018. Marlowe's marker stopped. She stood with her arm at her side. She looked at the board for 3 seconds, not checking, acknowledging. The way you acknowledge the end of something that has taken the majority of your available time to complete, not with celebration, but with the quiet of a person who has finally set down something heavy and is learning what their hands feel like empty. Then she turned around. The room did not move. 4 full seconds of silence, so complete that the projector fan in the ceiling was audible. A small mechanical hum that had been present for the entire colloquium and had never been perceptible until the room found a silence deep enough to hold it. The live stream counter read 81,000. Then from somewhere in the back of the room, a single pair of hands. One graduate student. One set of claps, deliberate, each one landing in the silence before the next. The sound of someone beginning something they were not sure others would join. Stellan Briggs stood up. He started clapping with the whole arm. Not the polite applause of an academic audience, acknowledging a competent presentation, but something more effortful, more total. The student beside him stood. The row behind them stood. The standing moved through the room in a wave from the front to the back, pulling people to their feet the way a tide pulls things that are already in motion, until the whole hall was standing. The noise building past the point where individual pairs of hands were distinguishable into a single layered sound that the camera microphone on the live stream actually distorted trying to capture. Vivian Alcafor sat in the front row and did not clap. She was looking at the board with her lips slightly parted, her eyes moving line by line from beginning to end, doing what she had been doing since Marlowe first approached the board, the mathematics herself in real time in parallel. Her expression was the expression of a person arriving at a result they had expected intellectually, but not prepared for emotionally, the experience of being correct about something while still being struck by it. Marlowe did not bow. She turned toward Merritt. He had not moved from the side of the stage. The stopwatch still hung from his right hand. The room's noise swelled around him, and he stood in it the way a structure stands in weather, present, unchanged in form, but no longer the largest thing. She walked to him slowly. The room's noise subsided by degrees as she approached people registering the motion and understanding that something was about to be said that deserved the quiet required to hear it. By the time she stopped 3 feet in front of him, the hall had returned to a stillness that was different from all the previous stillnesses of the morning. This one earned rather than imposed, chosen by the room rather than falling into it. Her voice when she spoke was not raised. The microphone on her uniform collar did what it had been doing since 8:44 its job. Professor Merritt, 3 things. He looked at her. His jaw was set. The expression on his face was not contempt that had burned off somewhere around the moment Vivian reset the clock. What remained was something older and less legible, the expression of a man who has arrived at a truth about himself that he is not yet equipped to articulate. First, you spent 9 years trying to prove this couldn't be done. She tilted her head slightly. You should have spent 30 seconds checking whether it was the right equation. His jaw moved. Nothing came out. Second, your boundary isn't intractable. It's been asked the wrong question by the wrong person for 9 years. A sound moved through the room, low, involuntary, the sound of something landing. She took one step closer. Her voice dropped, but the microphone held it. Third, the marriage bet. I'm not going to hold you to it. She watched something cross his face, the reflex of relief, brief, the hope of a man who thinks he has been handed a reprieve. Not because I lost. The relief closed. I didn't lose. Because I don't marry men I don't respect. A pause of the specific duration that gives a sentence its full weight. Judging by how long you've been alone, Professor, I think you already know that's a longer list than mine. The room made a sound that was neither laughter nor a gasp. It was the sound of 200 people receiving a truth delivered so precisely that there was no available response except to let it stand. Reeve Calloway in row 3 wrote both sentences down verbatim. She placed her pen flat across the top of the notebook, pressing the words beneath it, as if they might otherwise lift off the page. Marlowe turned to the board. She picked up the eraser. She pressed it to the derivation above her correction of line 3, Merritt's work, 9 years of published certainty rendered in chalk, and she wiped it clean in 2 long horizontal strokes that moved left to right across the board with the finality of a conclusion. She did not erase her own work. She did not erase his original line 3, which remained visible beneath her correction as the record of where the error had been. She erased everything he had built on top of it. What remained on the board was hers. She set the eraser in the tray. She walked off the stage at the side steps past her cart at the back of the aisle, through the service door into the corridor. Behind her, Vivian Okafor rose from the front row. She walked up the 3 steps to the panel platform. She walked to the board. She placed her palm flat against the closed-form solution just above where a signature would go if Marlowe had signed it, and turned to face the room with the cameras recording with the live stream counter on the back wall climbing past 90,000. For the record, I will be referring this proof to the Annals of Mathematics this afternoon. I'm requesting expedited review. Her hand remained on the board. Miss Hayes will be listed as sole author. The room erupted for the second time. Marlowe made it to the main foyer before her legs registered what the previous 2 hours had cost them. Not physically, the physical work had been minor, a few minutes at a board, the rest of it standing still. The cost was of a different order. The expenditure of 10 years of private discipline suddenly exposed to public air, the experience of having been invisible for so long that visibility itself had become a form of exertion. She stood in the foyer with her hand against the wall beside the water fountain, not for support, but for orientation. The building's lobby was empty. Everyone was still in Hall G. Through the closed doors, she could hear the room's noise, attenuated by distance, but still substantial, still containing the specific quality of something that had not finished resolving. Footsteps behind her. Running steps, the kind that belong to someone who has decided to catch up to something before it gets away. Stellan Briggs came through the corridor door, breathing hard, his notebook under his arm, carrying a manila folder against his chest with both hands, in the manner of someone transporting something fragile. He stopped several feet from her. His face was wet. He had been crying in the way that people cry when they have not given themselves permission to cry, and the permission has been revoked by circumstances beyond their management. He held the folder out. It was hers. The folder marked Inventory Q3 in soft pencil. Her folder from the lower rack of her cart in the supply closet on the 3rd floor. She looked at it. I found it 6 months ago. His voice had the unsteady quality of a person speaking through something that is still happening to them. Fire inspection. We were clearing the supply closets on 3. He swallowed. I read it. All of it. Another swallow. I went back to the closet every week. Every week for 6 months. I read every page you added. He pressed the folder slightly toward her, the gesture of someone offering a thing they know they had no right to hold. I knew. I knew what you had. I knew what it meant, and I didn't. He stopped. Started again. I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself there was a reason you hadn't submitted it. I told myself a lot of things. His voice broke on the last word, and he let it break. I'm sorry, I should have said something. I should have told you. Marlo looked at him for a long moment. She took the folder. She opened it. The 94 pages were there, her own handwriting, in its small, tight rows, every page intact. The 6 proofs in sequence, the 3 that resolved open problems, flagged with her own small triangles in the upper margins. She turned through several pages without reading them closely, not checking their content, but confirming their presence. The way you confirm the presence of something you had believed lost. She closed the folder. She did not absolve him. She did not tell him it was fine, that he didn't need to apologize, that no harm had been done. These were all things that were not true. She held the folder against her chest the same way he had been holding it, and she looked at him with the steady expression of a person who has decided to receive an apology without deciding yet what to do with it. The corridor door opened again. Reeve Calloway, slightly out of breath, pressed credential, visible phone in her jacket pocket. She had heard the last portion of the exchange from the doorway. She stopped a respectful distance away. Miss Hayes. Her voice had the quality of someone who has spent her career learning when to be quiet before speaking. I'm filing tonight, front page above the fold. A pause. With your permission. Marlo looked at her, looked at the folder in her hands, looked at the building around her, the lobby she had crossed 600 times in a decade, the floors she had learned by their specific acoustic properties, the waste bins whose contents she knew better than the people who filled them. She nodded once. That night, Preston Merritt sat alone in his office with the overhead lights off. The window gave onto the courtyard, where the lamppost light laid a long rectangle across the floor. He had been sitting for 40 minutes. His laptop was open to the 2017 paper, the published version, the version he had not been alone with in a long time, because he had not needed to be alone with it. It had existed in a managed relationship with his public life, serving its function, requiring nothing from him except the continued willingness to not look at what he had seen and crossed out in a graduate carol in 2016 late at night alone. He was looking at it now. Stellan had come to the door an hour ago. Merritt hadn't invited him in, but he hadn't sent him away either, which for their relationship constituted a kind of permission. Stellan had stood in the doorway and set a printed copy of Marlo's board work on the corner of the desk. He had said one thing before leaving. She cited the 1962 Russian paper, the one you found in your 3rd year. She knew where you found it. She knew you'd seen it. Merritt had not responded. Stellan had gone. He was sitting with that sentence now in the dark, with line 3 visible on the laptop screen. The sentence contained more information than its words, the same way line 3 had always contained more information than he had been willing to receive from it. He looked at it the way he had looked at it in 2016, late at night alone, and then he recognized it. This time he did not cross it out. He sat with it. That was all. He sat with it in the dark, with the lamppost light on the floor, and he let himself understand that the 9 years he had spent defending a position were 9 years spent defending himself against a correction that a 29-year-old woman had made on a kitchen table at 2 in the morning, working alone without equipment or institution or any assurance that anyone would ever look at it. He was 35 years old. He felt like a man at the far end of something, looking back at the length of it, trying to calculate how much of it had been mathematics and how much had been fear. He closed the laptop. He sat in the dark for a long time. The morning of Callum Dressler's last official day at Harvard began the way his mornings had begun for 35 years early, quiet, the walk from his car to the building, carrying the specific quality of routine that was also on this particular morning, its own kind of elegy. He had cleared most of his office the previous week. What remained were the things that had accumulated in the spaces behind other things, the books that stood behind the visible books, the folders pushed to the back of the deep drawer, the small objects that accrue in a life lived mostly in one room and acquire their significance from duration rather than importance. In the back of the deep drawer, he found a single sheet of paper in a plastic sleeve. He had put it there 2 years ago, on a Tuesday afternoon in October, folded it once without looking at it in the corridor, slipped it into his jacket, and transferred it to the sleeve that same evening when he understood what he was holding. He had not looked at it since. He had told himself he was keeping it in case it was needed. He had known with the specific knowledge we carry in the part of ourselves that we do not consult directly that he was keeping it because setting it down would require deciding what it meant, and deciding what it meant would require deciding what he was. He held it up to the window light. Marlowe's handwriting, small, tight, perfectly aligned, half a page of notation that was he could see now in full light with the prior day's context, one of the more elegant intermediate steps in the proof she had presented on the live stream. He had been holding a page of her work for 2 years without telling her. He had taken it from her folder on a Tuesday in October and carried it into his career's final chapter while she pushed her cart down the corridor outside his department. He put the sheet carefully in his breast pocket. He spent 2 hours finishing the clearing of the office. He signed the paperwork, facilities required, shook hands with the department administrator, took the elevator to the first floor. The building was already full morning classes. The ordinary noise of an institution that had not paused would not pause for the departure of one person who had been present in it for longer than most of its current occupants had been alive. He crossed the lobby. Marlo Hayes was not there. She was by now on her way to a meeting at Princeton. Vivian Okafor had made 2 calls before she left the building the previous afternoon. The supply closet on the 3rd floor contained cleaning chemicals, a spare cart rack, a box of industrial trash liners, a thermos that had been left behind. The folder marked Inventory Q3 was not there. Dressler walked out of the main entrance into the October air, the same air the morning carried when he'd walked in for the first time in September of 1991, or close enough to it that the body could not distinguish. He stopped on the front steps. He reached into his breast pocket. He took out the sheet of paper in its plastic sleeve. He looked at it in the morning light, Marlowe's handwriting, her notation, one page of a proof that was going to appear in the annals of mathematics with her name as sole author. He had held this for 2 years. That fact was not going to change. What could change was what he did with the time that came after it. He put the page back in his breast pocket close to the sternum and walked down the steps for the last time. He did not go home. He drove to Princeton. He did not call ahead. He did not know if Marlo would see him. He did not know what he would say beyond the truth, which was small and sufficient and 2 years overdue. He found parking a block from the Institute, sat in the car for 4 minutes, then got out and walked to the entrance. He asked for Marlo Hayes at the front desk. The receptionist made a call. He waited in the lobby for 6 minutes, long enough to consider leaving, twice long enough to understand that leaving would be the same choice he had made in the corridor 2 years ago, which was the choice he was here to unmake. Marlo came through the interior door and stopped when she saw him. She looked at him with the expression of a person who has learned not to be surprised by the world, but is in this specific instance surprised. She said nothing. She waited. Dressler reached into his breast pocket. He took out the sheet of paper in its plastic sleeve and held it out to her. "I took this." His voice was the voice of a man who had rehearsed nothing, which meant it was the most honest voice available to him. 2 years ago, I read it and I understood what it was. Then I went to a faculty meeting. He kept his arm extended. "I'm retiring today. I needed you to know that this," he looked at the page, then at her, "is the most important mathematics I held in 35 years. I held it in my hands and I put it in a drawer." Marlo looked at the page. She took it. She looked at her own handwriting, the small, tight notation she recognized from 100 kitchen table mornings, this particular page as familiar as the rest of them. She turned it over. She turned it back. She looked at Dressler. She did not say it was fine. She did not offer him absolution he had not earned. But she held the page with both hands, and she did not give it back, and after a moment she said, "Thank you for bringing it." He nodded once. He understood the economy of what she had given him. He walked back to the parking lot. He drove home to Cambridge in the particular quality of quiet that belongs to people who have put something down that they have been carrying long enough for the weight to feel normal. His hands on the wheel were steady. The October light came through the windshield at the flat angle of late morning and lit the dashboard the color of something ending. 6 months after the colloquium, the lecture hall at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton occupied the specific quality of quiet that belongs to rooms before they begin, the quiet of potential of an audience assembled and waiting of a board that is still clean. The hall was small by Harvard standards, 40 seats in a shallow arc, morning light coming through the windows on the east wall at the angle that belongs to late autumn. Marlo Hayes stood at the board. She was wearing the same kind of clothes she had always worn, plain practical, chosen for the day's work rather than the day's occasion. Her hair was in the same bun. The glasses were the same frame, the white tape on the left hinge gone, because someone at the Institute had quietly replaced the screw, but the frame itself unchanged because she had been asked once if she would like new glasses, and she had considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all questions and said she liked the frame. In the front row, 3 women with notebooks open watched the board with the focused attention of people who had come to learn something specific. In the second row, 2 more graduate students sat with the forward lean of people who had heard things about this room and this person that they were now here to verify with their own presence. In the back row, in a northeastern hoodie that still had the slight stiffness of being relatively new, Isaiah had driven down from Boston that morning before 6 a.m. He had not told Marlo he was coming. He had decided that some things did not require permission, only presence. She turned to the room. She looked at it the way she had learned to look at rooms over the past 6 months, not as spaces that were or were not prepared for her, but as spaces that became what happened in them. This room was about to become a mathematics lecture given by Marlo Hayes, and that was what it was, and the question of whether the room had expected to be that was not one she was obligated to hold. She turned to the board. She wrote one word in the center of it, the marker moving with the clean efficiency of someone for whom the action has become natural through repetition. "Hello." She turned back to the class. The smile that crossed her face was the first one the Institute had seen from her in any official context. Not the small, controlled expressions that had appeared in the coverage of the colloquium. Not the composure she had held through the subsequent weeks of interviews and institutional attention, but something that came from a different place. The place where a person keeps the parts of themselves they don't spend professionally. "Before we begin the lecture," she said, her voice carrying the specific warmth of someone who has decided that the first thing they will do in this room is refuse to be formal about the things that matter. "I'd like to know your names." She looked across the arc of the room. Her eyes settled on the student in the back left corner. Not the most visibly eager, not the one with the best posture, but the quiet one. The one who had arrived early and chosen the seat with the most distance between herself and the front. The one who had the expression of a person who has been told directly or otherwise that rooms like this were not built for people like her. Marlo pointed. "You first." The student opened her mouth. The room held. The top drawer of Marlo's desk at the Institute contained one personal item. A small frame, $4 from the thrift store on Nassau Street, the kind of frame that doesn't announce itself. In it, preserved behind glass, a paper napkin slightly creased from the fold it had traveled in for 6 months inside a calculus textbook on the lower rack of a cleaning cart. The handwriting on it was not hers. The derivation was not complete. Line 3 was crossed out with 2 horizontal strokes and rewritten in the margin with the same error it had contained the first time. Beside the framed napkin, not framed, just laid flat in the drawer, 1 page in a plastic sleeve. Her own handwriting, small and tight. 1 page from the folder that had traveled under her cart for 6 months, taken from her without her knowledge. On a Tuesday in October, held in a desk drawer for 2 years. Returned on a morning when a 64-year-old man drove 2 hours because the alternative was living the rest of his life as the kind of person who doesn't. She kept both. The napkin reminded her of 2 things simultaneously: that someone had looked at the problem and stopped, and that she had looked at the same problem and continued. The page reminded her of something different: that the mathematics had existed complete before anyone acknowledged it. That the proof had been true in the supply closet before it was true on the board. That the truth of a thing does not wait for permission from the room it hasn't yet entered. Outside her window, the Princeton campus moved through its ordinary afternoon. Students crossed the quad. A professor walked with his head down against the windcoat pulled close. The ordinary life of an institution doing its ordinary work, unaware of what was in the drawer of the office on the second floor, unaware of the 10 years of kitchen table mathematics that had preceded the woman now sitting at the desk, unaware of all the other drawers in all the other rooms, in all the other buildings across this country, where someone was sitting alone with work they had not yet decided to carry into the light. The question was not whether those drawers existed. The question was, what happened the morning someone decided to open them?